I have just started recording. And what we looked at last was evolution on the Hawaiian chain of islands, because those have formed over a hotspot. And the thing about hotspot volcanoes is they'll form on top of the hotspot and then go dormant as the plate moves them off the hotspot, which means that volcano islands that form on a hotspot form in a time order. The Hawaiian Islands get geologically younger as you go from northwest to southeast. And the last thing I showed you was that this is also the primary direction that speciation has happened. There's been a lot of speciation by dispersal from one island to the next. And the majority of it has been speciation from older islands to younger islands. A little bit of back dispersal, but that's primarily what we get. Now let's look a bit at a more global picture, and I'll start 94 million years ago. Pangea has already broken up some time ago. It started breaking up roughly 200 million years ago. The North Atlantic is only beginning to widen, and running right across, more not quite on the equator, but there's a shallow ocean running right around the middle of the Earth that I've just outlined there, and we call it Tethys. And the Tethys Ocean is now, parts of it are the Indian Ocean, parts are the Mediterranean, parts of it are the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. And that's what divides Gondwana to the south and Laurasia to the north. Incidentally, there's some cool rocks in southwest Arkansas that are this age or just a bit younger. And you might notice that there was what we call the Western Interior Seaway cutting right across North America, this very shallow ocean. You could, in theory, have swum from Arkadelphia all the way to the Yukon Territory of Canada, assuming you really wanted to. Lots of marine critters in southwest Arkansas date from this time, including, well, never mind. So at 94 million, Gondwana started rifting apart. North America and Eurasia are still pretty close. The Atlantic is only just beginning to widen, but Africa has broken away. India is beginning to drift away as its own little continent. Australia and Antarctica are still joined together, and South America is still really close to this Antarctic peninsula right there. I should mention that Randall Munroe, the artist who created the webcomic XKCD, has an alternate continental reconstruction. Here you can see Laurasia up here shouting, Red Rover, send India over." And that's how the Himalayas formed. Anyway, the same time, a time period we now call the Late Cretaceous, it's the last good time for the dinosaurs, except for the ones that are birds. This time frame, this is when you get T-Rex and Triceratops and things like that. It's also the time when mammals are diversifying. Mammals are almost as old as dinosaurs, but until the dinosaurs' extinction, most of them would have been somewhere between the size of a shrew and the size of a squirrel. The largest one that we know of so far got up roughly to Cocker Spaniel size. But this is the time when a lot of evolution is going on, and this is when we start seeing mammals that we can identify as marsupials or placentals, or there's a third lineage that's died out called multituberculates. So this is when basal mammal evolution is happening. That's a marsupial from this time frame from Mongolia. Most mammal fossils don't look nearly this good, but Mongolia happens to have rock layers of this age where critters were buried in sandstorms, which means that they died, got buried, and were preserved nearly complete. So that's a marsupial. We can tell because there's features of the pubis, for example, that correlate. And marsupials appear in Asia. That's where the oldest known are. Mongolia is over here, but they managed to disperse all the way to North America, down through South America, and into Antarctica and Australia, either on land or by dispersing via island chains and various land bridges. So marsupials managed to get all the way around the world. Almost as old as marsupials are placental mammals, the ones that nourish their offspring with a placenta. But for whatever reason, it may have just simply been luck. Not very many placentals made it to Australia, and the ones that did died out there. What happened then is that Gondwana continues to break up, and marsupials in Australia had the place pretty much to themselves, and they underwent various adaptive radiations. This is what Darwin had seen and made him think that there must be two creator gods, one for the rest of the world and one for Australia. Well, he didn't seriously think that. It was just a funny idea he had. This is ultimately why there's so many weird marsupials in Australia, is marsupials got there first. They radiated there. The placentals that made it to Australia died out, except for whales, bats, and seals, which of course can fly and swim. And the marsupials radiated into forms like, there's a Nagamaroo up there at the top, and the predatory killer kangaroo Ecalptodata down there at the bottom. Very strange forms that don't look like anything you've ever seen. And so that's why for millions of years, Australia didn't have any native placentals except for bats, marine mammals, and about 4 million years ago, a couple of rodents dispersed there. And then since humans got there at least 50,000 years ago, they brought dingoes, domestic dogs, and then Europeans emigrating there brought rabbits and cats and foxes and things like that. But that's why the marsupials were so diverse in Australia, and they've radiated into this diversity of forms that include a lot of species that are convergent on placental mammals. So we have marsupial anteaters and marsupial moles, marsupial wolves, although they're extinct, marsupial mice, and so on. Okay, so here we are at the time of extinction of the dinosaurs, 66 million years ago. Around here, we still have a lot of that western interior seaway. Tethys, this central ocean belt is still wide open. Australia is still stuck on Antarctica, but it's got its marsupials now. Africa has long separated. South America is beginning to separate. And when South America separated, there were marsupials in South America. And in fact, there still are about 60 marsupial species. And there were some placentals that made it to South America as well. There were some placentals that evolved in South America in isolation from the rest of the world, including a group called the pyrotheres, which were not found anywhere else, looked vaguely like elephants, but weren't really. South America used to have notungulates, which is another group of herbivorous mammals that range from critters the size of rhinos to critters the size of rabbits, like this Propachyrucus right there. And again, you get Australia happening again in that these early placental mammals that are there radiate into a diversity of forms, some of which look like mammals that you'd know, but aren't mammals that you would know. So we have this terrific radiation in South America as well. There were even, this is a South American marsupial, Thylacosmilus. It looks like a saber-toothed cat. You know what saber-toothed cats look like if you've ever seen Ice Age. But it's not related. It's a marsupial. It's another one of these crazy cases of marsupials evolving convergently with placental mammals. So convergent evolution does in fact happen. So uniquely South American mammals from this time frame include, as I've said, there's something like 60 species of marsupials still there in South America, like this Brazilian short-tailed possum. There's also a unique group of mammals called the xenarthrans, Greek for foreign joint, because the structure of the pelvis is unique and weird relative to everybody else. And that includes the armadillos, the anteaters, and the sloths. So here we've got a tree anteater and a screaming hairy armadillo, which I think would make a really good name for kind of a, cowboy punk band, the Screaming Hairy Armadillos. If any of you found a band by that name, I get 10%. Right. And this is, again, this also explains why Darwin was seeing this odd similarity between extinct mammals and living mammals in South America. It's because both of them belong to lineages that had been restricted to South America for all this time. So that's why you get, I think, 14 species of living armadillo in South America. And you get these fossil armadillo kin called glyptodons. The big, armadillos the size of riding mowers. This is why you find living tree sloths and extinct ground sloths in South America. It's because for all this time, South America was a giant island, and the mammal lineages there were undergoing these evolutionary radiations separate from what was going on in the rest of the world. The difference is that South America was not ever as completely isolated from the rest of the world as Australia was. And so probably across the Atlantic, which was narrower and also we think had some little rocky islands on it, the ancestors of New World primates managed to disperse probably from Africa across the Atlantic to South America. So did the ancestors of a major group of rodents called the caviomorphs. They probably dispersed across the Atlantic at about the same time. And their descendants include South American monkeys. There's an emperor tamarin at the upper right. Marmosets are South American monkeys, howler monkeys, owl monkeys, spider monkeys, I think capuchin monkeys. Those are the ones that organ grinders used to use. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those. I think I saw one in Atlanta when I was about 8, but certainly not recently. Anyway, South American monkeys come from there, and so do South American rodents, including the capybara, the largest rodent in the world. There's a mara, that's a rodent that's convergent on a rabbit. Guinea pigs, which are not from Guinea, they are from South America. Talk to Vicki McDonald sometime, hopefully when it's when we can all visit each other's offices, because she visited South America and saw some cathedrals from the colonial period. And there's a mural that someone painted of the Last Supper with Jesus and the 12 disciples sitting at a table laden with roasted guinea pig, because the people that made that interpreted the stories, according to their own culture. Anyway, never mind. So yeah, roast guinea pig, that's another South American unique mammal. By about 14 million years ago, one of the things to notice is that global climate has gotten quite a bit colder because Antarctica is now separate from the rest of the world. And we think that what you've got is now you can have a current that runs full time around and around and around Antarctica, the Antarctic circumpolar current. There's no land masses that could push it up into warmer climates and warm up all of that water. So with the current orbiting Antarctica, the Antarctic circumpolar current, as it's sensibly called, that generates this body of very cold water. You also have the Himalayas going up right here. And one of the ways you get rid of greenhouse gases is weathering of silicate rocks. If you take a whole bunch of rocks and stick them up in the breeze and just let them weather, some key minerals will combine with carbon dioxide and turn into clays. And, that's not the sort of thing we can probably usefully harness to fix our own little climate problem. But one of the effects of having this Himalayas forming is you have this enormous range of mountains that suddenly get shoved way up into the atmosphere, and it begins to weather, and that may have been enough to scrub some CO2 out of the atmosphere. So the upshot is that global temperature by this stage has gotten a lot more chilly. Antarctica's developed an ice cap. There's ice growing in the Arctic. It's not like the days of the dinosaurs when you had herds of grazing dinosaurs on Alaska's North Slope. Anyway, let's look over here at South America. There's a subduction zone growing right here along the margin of the Americas. There still is, by the way, this is what has thrown up the Andes Mountains of South America. They're basically an arc. This is what's throwing up the Cascade Mountains up here. And it's also starting to build land right in here where the Isthmus of Panama is going to form. Right there. And when the isthmus formed, guess what that did to the ocean life that had been there, that had been part of the seaway called Tethys? Well, what happens to it starts with a V and rhymes with vicariance. Get it? Okay, here's what it looks like today, and right there's the Isthmus of Panama. You first start getting really solid land there roughly 4 million years ago. And if you look at the marine invertebrates here in the Caribbean and the marine invertebrates here on the Pacific coast, you get things like this. Strombus pugilis, some of you actually got to handle in the shell lab that we did. That's a Caribbean species. That's one I remember picking up when I was 4 at Puerto Rico, which is, of course, right there. Strombus gracilior over here, that's a Pacific province species. I picked up some of those as a grad student over here when I went down with a group of graduate school colleagues who were doing a great deal of research for their dissertations and also taking drugs, but that's another story. And you have these two species that look very, very similar. The difference is they're on opposite sides of the isthmus. And you find that pattern over and over again. So here's a Caribbean rock snail, Purpura patula, right there, compared with Purpura panza. And you can see the overall, I mean, there's minor differences in the color pattern and things like that, but the overall shell shape and certainly ecological niche and details of the soft anatomy and things like that, they're all very similar. And the main difference is that one of these is Caribbean and the other is Pacific. And you get lots of cases where you'll have twin species that look an awful lot alike, except one is Caribbean and one is Pacific. And the simplest explanation is that before the isthmus formed, we had rock snails and Strombus conchs and a whole bunch of others that would be living all through this area on both the Pacific and the Caribbean sides. And then when the isthmus forms, that sets up a barrier. And what used to be one species splits into two. The guy I used to go down to the Gulf of California with was actually working on a doctoral dissertation involving limpets, these cone-shaped snails. They're snails, but their shells don't coil. They just look like little peaks. And he was collecting limpets from the Pacific coast of Mexico and also from the Caribbean, and also taking drugs. And well, he was. You don't know what it was like driving 1,000 miles up the
I know, it's just
up Baja California on a highway that's about 1.5 miles wide, where the driver is coming down after having baked his brains with shrooms all day. It was an interesting
sober, so.
Well, yeah, you know, I got the straight edge, man. But yeah, it was an yeah, I just had fun skin diving and all that. It was yeah.
But,
You know, I think of weird enough stuff when I'm stone cold sober. I'm not even tempted. No, that wasn't Whitey. That was Brian Simonson, who now has a much higher paying job than I'll ever get. Okay, never mind. You guys did not need to hear that. So my colleague, lucky bastard, demonstrated that this was the pattern that you get when you look at the evolution of limpets. And this was a fairly recent study on species of pistol shrimp in the genus Alpheus, so called because that modified claw that you see over there is capable of snapping. They're able to snap their claws in such a way that they create powerful shock waves that stun their prey. So Alpheus will just, if you're a fish or something like that, Alpheus can just walk right up to you and go bang, and you're stunned, and then Alpheus eats you. Pistol packing shrimp. Anyway, there's a partial cladistic analysis. It's based on molecules of species on both sides of the isthmus. And to show you the pattern, I've colorized it. So the Pacific species are in that teal and the Caribbean species are in light blue. And what I want you to see is that every Pacific species has a Caribbean species as its closest relative. So Estuarensis right there is Caribbean. Its closest relative is Columbiensis, which is Pacific. Right? Antipenultimus is Pacific. Its closest relative, Chasei, is Caribbean, and this happens all over. In fact, this is only a part of the cladogram. They found about 20 pairs of species that are separated only by that isthmus, 20 pairs of sibling species. So lots of vicariance took place in the marine realm when the Isthmus of Panama was formed. On the other hand, What's vicariance for the marine critters was the avenue for dispersal for the land critters, because things that live on land, of course, can disperse down the Isthmus of Panama. Not everybody can disperse down the Isthmus of Panama, partly because, well, there's actually an area of Panama where nobody's been able to build any roads because it's this impassable swamp. There's about 25 miles called the Darien Gap, where no roads are possible. So that's why you can't drive from North America to South America on roads. You have to take a ferry. But life finds a way, and coming up from the south, we get armadillos, right? Our armadillos are South American migrants, and possums. The possums that, well, that we have living in our garage are descended from South American migrants that came north. We don't have living sloths anymore in North America. They have died out, but we used to have giant sloths in North America. Porcupines are South American rodents that migrated north. And then South America got our oaks. Oaks are almost entirely Laurasian, except there's one lonely South American oak species. South America got bears. Bears are almost entirely Laurasian, except for the South American sun bear, I believe. South America got its cats. They've got mountain lions. There's Central American cats like ocelots and margays, but there's some other South American unique little cats that descended from North American ancestors. Raccoons and rabbits and skunks and camels and tapirs are all North Americans that went south. And we call this the Great American Interchange, where the biotas of North and South America played this game of fruit basket upset. So possums come north, bears go south. I guess that's the spectacled bear, is the, look up spectacled bears sometimes. They look kind of weird. When you see them walk, they look like people in bear suits. Got kind of a strange build to them. But that's a North American lineage that dispersed to the south. We got their porcupines. They got jaguars. And then camels actually used to be endemic to Laurasia. You know, you still find them in Asia and the Middle East. And we had them in North America until about 11 odd thousand years ago. That skull that you see is on display at the Page Museum at the La Brea Tar Pits in Los Angeles. That's where it was found. So we used to have camels here. And the thing is, they dispersed south, and then they died out in North America. So it's not obvious, but the death of North American camels left the Yama lineage all alone. Sorry. Right. No, the Flying Karamazov brothers used to say, "Don't worry, we're insured by Yoids of Mexico." Anyway, I digress. So that's how South America got its llamas and vicuñas and alpacas. Those are North American camels that dispersed southward and then lost their North American kin. There it goes. And then we used to have native horses in North America, and some of them dispersed south. The problem is that they died out on both continents roughly 11,000 years ago. There's an extinction of what's called the macrofauna. Basically, the big mammals and birds suffer an extinction at about that time. Whether it was climate change, human hunting, or a mixture of both is something that's still under discussion. But they died out on both continents And so there were no horses on either continent until Europeans introduced them in the 16th century. We don't really have true wild horses in North America. We have feral horses. They're breeding successfully and have adapted well in many parts of the West, but they're still a species that was introduced from Europe. They're not, they didn't evolve here significantly. Meanwhile, if we go back and look at Australia, you might remember that Darwin was puttering away on his giant book that would explain everything. And in 1858, he got a letter from a chap named Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace does deserve some credit for developing the theory of evolution by natural selection. Technically, it's a tie because the men put a joint paper together explaining their ideas that came out in 1858. Yes, had a gentleman's agreement, and Wallace probably deserves more credit than he gets. But he's well known in the field of biogeography because he kept on exploring that part of the world, going back to Indonesia to collect his beetles, among other things. He was collecting there because that was his job. He came from a poor background and he was earning a living going off to wild and woolly parts of the globe and collecting rare animals and plants and selling them to museums and private collectors back home. Yeah, sort of an Indiana Jones career. And during his studies in Indonesia and Malaysia from 1857 to 1862, he documented that there seems to be a line in the ocean dividing one group of islands from another. It's now called Wallace's Line. West of the line, you get birds, mammals, fish, and plants that are typical of mainland Asia. You get tigers, rhinos, pheasants, squirrels, orangutans, monkeys. East of the line, you get Australian type critters. You find cockatoos, megapodes, known in Australia as brush turkeys. I'm not sure if they taste that good, but they look vaguely turkey-ish, although they aren't. Marsupials like the tree climbing couscous, birds of paradise, and the line separated islands that were otherwise almost indistinguishable. Here he writes in 1857 about the islands of Bali and Lombok. They're within sight of each other. They're separated by maybe 20 miles. You can see one from the other. They're of nearly the same size, of the same soil, aspect, elevation, and climate, yet differ considerably in their productions, and in fact belong to two quite distinct zoological provinces, of which they form the extreme limits. So there's Wallace's line, this red line right there. Separates Bali, which is over here on the west, from Lombok on the east, 20 miles apart. You could see one from the other. Separates Borneo, this big island up here is Borneo, this kind of spidery looking island. I believe that's Celebes right there. And then to the south here, this is New Guinea. Way down here is the Australian mainland. And then up here, you've got Indonesia, and this continues on up to Thailand and the Asian mainland. So to the west, you get trogons. That's that colorful bird right there. There's an Asian squirrel. And that, of course, is an Asian tiger. And you get rhinos and monkeys. You get civets, kin to weasels and mongoose, I believe. You get deer. You get critters that are typical of Asia and ultimately typical of Laurasia, like deer. To the east, there's a cuscus right there. That's a tree climbing, fruit eating marsupial. There's a cockatoo that I'm sure you're familiar with. You get cockatoos and Australian type parrots. There's a tree kangaroo from New Guinea. And down there at the lower right, that's a brush turkey or a megapode bird, some of which live on volcanic islands and are unique because they'll actually incubate their eggs in warm volcanic sand. Only birds I'm aware of that use geothermal energy to hatch their babies. And so there's that line that separates these two. Look, computer animation. Why should it be there? Wallace explained it that the islands to the east, beyond Java and Borneo, so the ones over here with the cuscus and cockatoos and megapodes and all that, do essentially form a part of a former Australian or Pacific continent. It is interesting to observe among the islands themselves how a shallow sea always intimates a recent land connection. What's he mean? Completely separate from plate tectonics, not directly connected to it, is the fact that sea level has fluctuated over time. And the Earth's climate changes over time. It's what climates do. There have been times when it's been much more extreme than anything we are likely to see. You know, what people are worried about, of course, is not that the Earth's climate is changing, but that it's changing unprecedentedly fast in ways that are going to do a great deal of damage to human society. But climates do change. And when global climate is cold, ice sheets form and build up till about, what, 13,000 years ago. We had ice sheets covering North America all the way to Des Moines, Iowa. A long day's drive from here would have gotten you to a place that was covered with ice. Northern North America was completely icebound. Yeah, Canada was almost completely icebound. And that water making up that ice sheet has to come from somewhere. It doesn't just magically appear. And it forms because of snow falling and then compacting down into these ice sheets. And that means that if the ice sheets form, that means that the sea level drops. And so when the sea level was lower, a lot of areas that are now shallow would have been connected because they all share a continental shelf. So right there, this is not a great cartographer, but that's Thailand, more or less. Laos and Vietnam are up here. Malaysia is more or less this. Singapore is right there. Indonesia is all of that. You've got the Philippine Islands are right there. And you see that all of these areas are joined by continental shelf, this shaded in area called the Sunda Shelf right there. This is now shallow ocean. It used to be dry land when the sea level was considerably lower. So critters could easily migrate all through this area. And there's shelf over here connecting Australia with New Guinea. So New Guinea and Australia, critters could disperse to and from. But it just so happens that right where Wallace's line lies, there's no shelf. Bali and Lombok might be only 20 miles apart, but the ocean between them is something like 10, 15,000 feet deep. So there was never a corridor by which critters could disperse across Wallace's line, at least not by walking or growing on land. The other thing that's maintaining Wallace's line is that this is an island arc. Indonesia is. All of this, that's an arc, and it is one of the world's most violent. The biggest eruption in recorded history, Tambora, took place here in 1814 and was big enough to alter global climate for a year. Tambora put so much volcanic ash into the atmosphere that it dimmed sunlight all over the world, and 1815 became known as the year without a summer. That was the year that like Pennsylvania was having, freezes in June. That was the year that a lot of New England farmers gave up and started moving west, and possibly including some of your ancestors, for all I know. Krakatoa, 1883, the biggest eruption that was ever really well documented, the one whose sound was heard 3,000 miles away, the one that sent a shockwave through the atmosphere around the world twice. No, wait, the atmospheric shockwave went around the world 7 times. It was the ocean waves that went around the world twice. That was in Indonesia as well. So it makes it a bit of an obstacle to disperse from island to island along the Indonesian subduction zone when those islands are constantly going boom and killing everything on them. And as in the case of Krakatoa, dismantling themselves completely. 4/5 of the island of Krakatoa ceased to exist when it erupted in 1883. So that's tended to block dispersal this way as well, and that's tended to maintain Wallace's line. And Wallace's line is just one of the borders between what we call global biogeographic realms or ecozones. And it's right there, separating what we now call the Australasian realm from the Indo-Malayan realm. And then, of course, we're in the Nearctic in South America and Central. That's the Neotropic realm. We have the Afrotropic and Palearctic. And then, of course, there's Antarctic and the Pacific Islands of Oceania. All of these are areas where we can find common, features, common members of biological taxa. And a major part of what has set these up and created them is, lo and behold, plate tectonics. One of the coolest ideas that anybody's ever had. And good grief, I feel really bad about letting you guys go early, but that seems to be the end of the slides. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the